last thing my grandfather ever asked me to do was water his tomato plants. He said it like it was nothing, like he'd be back in a week. He was sitting up in the hospital bed they'd moved into the living room by then, and he pointed at the kitchen window where three ceramic pots were lined up on the sill, and he said, "Don't let Vera's tomatoes die. She planted those the spring before she passed, and I've kept them going every year since. That was 6 years ago. 6 years of tomatoes. I didn't even like tomatoes. I said I wouldn't let them die." He died 4 days later, on a Tuesday morning, while I was making coffee in his kitchen and trying not to cry into it. My grandfather's name was Harold, and he was the kind of man who fixed things, not just objects, though he did that too, the drawer that stuck, the screen door that never quite closed right, but situations. He was the person you called when something went wrong, when you didn't know what to do, when the problem felt too large to look at directly. For most of my life, I had assumed that quality would outlast him somehow, that the steadiness of him would linger. I was not prepared for how loud the silence was after. I am a paralegal. I have been for 4 years working at a small estate and family law firm about 20 minutes from the house where I grew up. I tell you this because it matters. It matters to what happened, and it matters to why I was the one who ended up in charge of things, and it matters to why I saw it coming before anyone else did. My brother is 3 years older than me. I will call him my brother because that is what he is, technically, and because I have spent the last year and a half figuring out how to hold that fact without letting it mean more than it does. He has a wife, 2 kids I genuinely love who are in no way responsible for any of this. He lives about 40 minutes away and had, in the 2 years before my grandfather got sick, called maybe 6 times. I know because I checked once, after everything, in a moment of needing to understand the shape of things. 6 times in 2 years. When my grandfather was diagnosed, my brother called more. I noticed that. I was the one who drove to appointments. I was the one who talked to the hospice coordinators, who reorganized the kitchen so that the things he needed were easier to reach, who stayed over on the nights when I was worried. I had a key. I knew where he kept the important papers, not because I was nosy, but because he had shown me a few years earlier when his wife Vera passed. He had said, "You should know where things are, just in case." He had walked me through the filing cabinet in the back bedroom, the one with the brass handles that always needed a firm pull. He had shown me the folder labeled in his handwriting, neat and a little formal, the way his generation wrote. I knew what was in the will. I knew the house was meant to stay in the family, to eventually go to my mother and then to my brother and me. I knew there was a savings account with roughly $180,000 in it, accumulated over decades of careful, quiet living. I knew these things. I had not told my brother I knew these things. This is important. In the months while my grandfather was sick, my brother started asking questions. Not directly, not about amounts, but the kind of questions that circle something. Had Grandpa looked at the will recently? Was the savings still at the same credit union? Or had he moved it? Was the house paid off? Did I know? I answered the questions I could answer honestly, which wasn't many of them because I was careful. My husband, who is an engineer and thinks in systems, listened to me describe these conversations one night and said very quietly, "He's mapping the estate." I didn't want to believe that. I believed it anyway. My grandfather passed on a Tuesday. My brother arrived at the house 4 hours later, while I was still there, still moving through the strange underwater feeling of the first hours of grief. He hugged me. He cried. He sat at the kitchen table and drank coffee and said all the right things. And I sat across from him and felt something I didn't have a name for yet. Not suspicion exactly, more like vigilance. The way you feel standing at the edge of something high. The funeral was scheduled for that Friday. My mother was flying in Wednesday evening. There were calls to make and arrangements to handle and food to organize because people were going to come and there needed to be food, and all of that fell, as things tend to me. On Thursday morning, my brother texted me. He said he needed to swing by Grandpa's house to pick up a few things. Personal items he'd left there over the years. I said sure, I'd be there around 11 if you wanted to meet me. He said not to worry about it. He had a key from years ago. He'd just grab his things and lock up. I didn't think much of it. I was coordinating the catering order and trying to figure out the seating situation, and my mother had called twice before 8 in the morning about whether the flowers were the right color. On Friday morning, my grandfather's lawyer called me. His name was Mr. Ashford, And he was the kind of lawyer who has been doing estate work for 30 years and has seen everything twice. He called to confirm I'd be coming in the following week to begin the formal process. I said yes. He said, as a formality, that I should be aware that someone had called his office the previous day to inquire about the timeline for accessing the savings account. I asked who had called. He paused in the way that people pause when they're deciding how much to say. Then he said, "Your brother called." I went outside. I stood on my grandfather's porch, with the wind chimes Vera had hung 30 years ago and that Harold had never taken down. And I stood there until I felt something harden in a useful way. Not anger, more like clarity. I went back inside and I called my office. I asked my supervising attorney, whose name is Nadia and who has known me for 3 years, if I could talk through something. She said, of course. I told her everything. She listened without interrupting, which is one of the things I have always appreciated about her, and when I was done, she said, in the tone she uses when she is being precise, "So he's trying to get ahead of probate." I said yes. She said, "What do you have access to right now, legally?" I told her about the account. About the fact that my grandfather had added me as a joint account holder 2 years earlier, quietly, when Vera passed, because he said he didn't want things to be complicated if something happened to him. I had never used it. I had barely thought about it. My name was on it. Nadia was quiet for a moment and then she said, "Okay, here's what I would do. I will not walk through every step of that conversation. What I will say is that by the end of the afternoon, before my mother landed, before I went to pick her up from the airport, before the funeral I was hosting in 18 hours, I had moved the savings account funds into a new account in my name, documented the reason, and sent a letter to Mr. Jod, Ashford's office by email. My grandfather had trusted me to handle things. I intended to handle things. The funeral was on a Friday and it was a good service, genuinely. The church had the kind of afternoon light that made everything feel warmer than it was. People said real things about my grandfather, specific things, memories that I hadn't heard before that filled in pieces of him I hadn't known. A man he'd worked with in the 70s told a story about Harold staying 3 hours late on a Friday to help him figure out a wiring problem, for no reason other than that he was that kind of person. I stood at the reception afterward and held a plate of food I never ate, and thought about the tomato plants and whether I'd remembered to water them. My brother was there. He was fine, normal, appropriate. He helped with the chairs. He spoke to relatives I hadn't seen in years. If he was worried about anything, it didn't show. That Sunday, he called me. He said he wanted to talk about the estate, just informally, before the official meeting with the lawyer. He said he'd been doing some thinking and he thought it might make sense for him to handle the financial side of things, given that he was the oldest and had more experience with investments. I said I appreciated him thinking about it and that we should definitely talk more when the time came. I kept my voice completely even. After we hung up, I sat with my phone in my hand for a while. My husband came in from the other room. He didn't ask. He just sat down next to me. I said, "He's going to try to do it." My husband said, "I know." I said, "I already moved it." He looked at me for a moment. Then he said, "Good." That is the sentence I come back to sometimes, when I need to remember that I made the right call. Not a dramatic vindication. Not a long speech. Just, good. The formal meeting with Mr. Ashford was the following Wednesday. I had asked my mother to come, because I felt she should be present, and she had agreed without asking why, which meant she had her own sense of things that she hadn't said out loud. My brother arrived with his wife, which surprised me slightly. Mr. Ashford ran through the estate documents in the calm, unhurried way of someone who has done this many times. My grandfather's wishes were clear. The house was to remain in the family, with my mother holding the primary interest during her lifetime, the savings account, and here Mr. I at retime. Ashford looked at the papers in front of him. The savings account had been designated to transfer directly to me as joint holder upon Harold's death, with the remainder to be distributed according to the will. My brother's wife put her hand on my brother's arm. He looked at me across the table. I looked back at him. He said, very carefully, "I wasn't aware of that arrangement." I said, "Grandpa made it after Vera passed. He told me he didn't want things to be complicated." There was a silence that had a specific texture, the kind that happens when people are recalibrating. Mr. Ashford continued. In the weeks after the meeting, my brother made 2 attempts. The first was a conversation, a long phone call in which he explained that he was in a difficult financial position. that his mortgage was behind, that he had some debts he needed to address, and that he felt, as the older sibling, he deserved a more equitable share of what Grandpa had left. I listened to all of it. I asked questions in the way I've learned to ask questions at work, the kind that don't commit you to anything. At the end, I said I understood he was going through a hard time and that I hoped things improved for him. The second attempt came about 2 weeks later, through his wife, who called my mother to say that my brother had evidence that Grandpa had not been in a sound mental state when he made the joint account arrangement and that they were considering their legal options. My supervising attorney, when I told her, exhaled slowly and said, "He opened a joint account with you in front of witnesses at a credit union 2 years ago when he was definitively, documentably competent." I said I knew. She said, "This is not going to go anywhere." It did not go anywhere. What I did not expect, what I was genuinely unprepared for, was how long the grief and the legal situation would exist alongside each other. I had thought they would be separate. I had thought I would finish the estate business and then have space to miss my grandfather properly. It was not like that. The two things were tangled in ways I couldn't always separate. There were days when I was furious at my brother, and I couldn't tell how much of the fury was about the money, and how much was about the fact that he had turned the worst weeks of my life into a transaction. I watered the tomato plants every week. I brought them to my house in November because my grandfather's house was going through the transition process, and I didn't want them to die on a windowsill no one was watching. They are on my kitchen window right now. They never do very well in the winter, but they survive. Every spring they come back. I don't know what to say about my brother now, a year and a half later. He is still my brother. The kids still call me on my birthday, which I give them full credit for because no one taught them to do that. They just do it. His wife and I have not spoken, which I think is probably how it needs to be for a while. My mother knows everything. She has not said much about it, which is her way of saying quite a lot. What surprised me, more than anything else, was not the anger or the practicality or the legal maneuvering. It was the clarity. The strange, uncomfortable clarity of understanding exactly who someone is. Finally, after years of giving them the benefit of every doubt, my grandfather knew who I was. That is what the joint account was, really. Not a financial strategy, not a legal mechanism. It was a man who had spent 81 years watching people carefully, saying, "I see you. I trust you. I know you'll handle this." I think about him in the garden, in the flat morning light, sleeves rolled up, talking to the plants like they could hear him. Barra used to say he had conversations with the tomatoes. He never denied it. I keep the window seat clear. I haven't figured out yet what to put there. But I keep it clear. I still think about the moment Mr. Ashford said my name in connection with the account, and the way my brother's expression shifted across the table. Not shock, exactly. More like the specific look of someone who built a plan around an assumption and just watched the assumption dissolve. I don't think my brother is a monster. I spent a long time sitting with that because it would be easier if he were. Easier to be angry, easier to cut ties cleanly, easier to tell the story with a clear villain and a clear ending. But what he did was something more ordinary and, in some ways, more painful than villainy. He saw an opening and he moved toward it. He let the worst version of himself make the decisions during the worst months of my life, and then he had to sit across from me in a lawyer's office and understand what that had cost him. What I keep returning to is this. He and I were raised by the same people. We knew the same Herald. We sat at the same kitchen table and ate the same Sunday dinners, and were taught, at least nominally, the same things about how you're supposed to treat people. And somewhere along the way, something in him decided that what he was owed mattered more than what was right. I don't know when that happened. I'm not sure it matters. What I know is that my grandfather watched people carefully, 81 years of watching, and when it came time to do the quiet, undramatic thing that would matter most, he did it without announcement. He added my name to an account, and he showed me where the files were. And he said, without ever quite saying it directly, that he trusted me to be the person who handled things correctly. That kind of trust is not given lightly by a man like Harold. It is earned over years of small decisions, showing up when it's inconvenient, doing the right thing when no one is watching, not cutting corners just because you could. I was prepared when it mattered because I had paid attention, because Nadia had spent 3 years teaching me how estate documents actually work, how people actually behave, how the gap between what someone says and what they're planning is often visible if you know where to look. Knowledge isn't just information. It's the thing that lets you act instead of react. It's what turns a difficult situation into a manageable one if you're willing to do the work beforehand. And there was a moment, standing on my grandfather's porch, wind chimes moving, phone in my hand, when I could have done nothing. When I could have told myself it would probably be fine, that my brother wouldn't really go through with it, that I didn't want the confrontation. That moment passed, and I made a choice that required me to trust my own judgment over my own discomfort. That is not a small thing. Most of the times I have failed in my life, it has been because I chose the easier version of events over the accurate one. The tomatoes are still alive. That feels like the right place to end.